Our afternoon panel session, Reshaping Local Food Access, Creating Rapid Governmental Responses Equitably. Our moderator is Dr. Karen Madrid, Director of Sustainability and STEM at Houston-Tillotson University here in Austin. Carol Frazier, Food Systems Program Coordinator with the Economic Development Department with the City of Austin. Also, a special thanks to the City of Austin for being a generous sponsor for the CFRAE. Sheri Fleming, County Executive for Health and Human Services here in Travis County. Edwin Marty, Food Policy Manager, also with the City of Austin in the Office of Sustainability. And last, but certainly not least, Jennifer Stevenson, Environmental Program Coordinator from the Community Gardens Program.
Hi, everyone. Welcome to our afternoon panel. I'm really excited to be moderating this conversation on reshaping local food access, creating rapid governmental responses equitably. I'm Karen Magid. I am the moderator for this panel. I work at Houston-Tillotson University as the Director of Sustainability and STEM and as Special Assistant to President Burnett, who was on a fantastic panel this morning. And I also am the current chair of the Austin-Travis County Food Policy Board. So I'm really excited and want to jump right into this conversation. But I also wanted to just quickly say, yeah, please, throughout the panel, be adding questions into the chat, and we'll try to keep an eye on that and ask those towards the end. We're trying to reserve some time for Q&A. And with that, I want to just quickly frame this conversation and we'll jump into introductions. So as we've already seen, this conference is bringing together people from different sectors in the food system and beyond. And one of those critical sectors is government. Over the pandemic, we've seen the strong role of local government here. So that's really what's motivating this conversation. We've seen the complex municipal structures like twist and turn to respond rapidly to quickly changing community needs over the last year. So in this discussion, we're bringing together leaders from the City of Austin and from Travis County to discuss their innovative thinking and sharing what they've done and how they've done it and the partnerships that have helped them serve the region throughout the pandemic. And now how the lessons learned will help reshape the food system going forward. So with that, I'm going to hand it off to everyone to just quickly introduce yourselves, and then we'll jump into our questions. But let's first, I'm going to start with Chris.
Thanks, Karen. Hi, everybody. My name is Chris Schreck. I'm a program manager in the City of Austin Economic Development Department. My sort of normal line of work is in working with local businesses here in Austin to make sure that we can kind of connect them to resources and programs that are designed to help them grow and create more jobs and opportunity. But really, since March, I've been working on all of our different relief programming that ranges from the bridge loan program that we launched in early April to connect businesses to federal relief programs that we knew were coming, and then rolling out our grant programming to small businesses, nonprofit organizations, childcare centers, and now working on our legacy business grant program, which focuses on businesses that have been in operation for quite a while. So excited to have this conversation about how we can be more supportive of recovery here in Austin, particularly in the food sector.
Thanks. Sheri?
Hi, everyone. I'm Sheri Fleming. I'm the County Executive for Health and Human Services with Travis County. And we are, although we have health in our name, our public health requirements are met through an interlocal with the City of Austin. So Travis County HHS has a strong presence in the community around human services or social services, as you might think them. So clearly that's what brings us to the table in the discussion around food. Glad to be here.
Thank you. Jennifer?
All right. Hello, everyone. My name is Jennifer Stevenson, and I'm the Community Gardens Program Coordinator for the Austin Parks and Recreation Department. And so I'm going to be talking about how the community gardens within Austin responded during the pandemic. Happy to be here.
Thanks. And Edwin?
I'm Edwin Marty. I'm the Food Policy Manager with the City of Austin's Office of Sustainability. And during non-pandemic times, my job is to help the city think strategically about its role within the food system, addressing local food production, processing, distribution, consumption, retail, food insecurity, and food recovery. And then when the pandemic hit, got pulled into the emergency operations center's social service branch. We created a food access task force and have been working since last March on trying to address the pretty significant food insecurity needs as a result of the economic downturn and the pandemic. Getting to work with lots of the people that are both on this panel and in this conference, and delighted to just share some of the things that we've learned, some of the challenges that we've had, and some thoughts about maybe how we could do this differently, maybe better in the future. Thanks so much.
Thanks. So I want to jump right in. From your introductions, you've laid out, your areas in which you work, but I want to hear more detail and have you share more detail about what you've been doing. What are the new programs and some of these innovative projects that have happened over the course of the last year and throughout the pandemic? And I'm happy to just have everyone, I can throw it to people or just have you start your conversation as we've practiced. Let's start with Edwin then.
Sure. Thanks so much. Again, we, greeted the pandemic back in late February or March with a lot of uncertainty. The city of Austin and Travis County and others in the government have done a pretty good job over the years of dealing with natural disasters, or at least have had plans to deal with natural disasters, the sort of known natural disasters like hurricanes and droughts and fires and those kind of things. But a pandemic was a pretty different beast, and we do have a pandemic response plan. That said, it had never been implemented that I'm aware of. And so the response to the pandemic was, something of great uncertainty. One thing we knew was that it was going to be very different than other disasters, mainly because of the time that we're expecting to be responding. Natural disasters like hurricanes and those kind of things are fairly short and finite, but we knew the pandemic was going to last, months, maybe longer. Now we know years. And so fortunately, the organizational structure in the Emergency Operations Center created the social service branch, which was a way to try to help government basically respond over time to the most vulnerable community members. We realized pretty quickly that the economic impact of the pandemic was going to be felt across the community, but was going to be shouldered for the most part dramatically more by lower income community members, by those community members who are already vulnerable for a lot of different reasons. And so the social service branch was a way to sort of put into place systems to try to be responsive. And as part of that, we created the Food Access Task Force, which had never actually been created before in terms of a response to a natural disaster. And so my team got brought on board to help lead that effort. And so we spent the first couple of weeks of March just trying to figure out what we were doing, because we'd never done that before. There were certainly sort of precedents for addressing emergency food during natural disasters, but not anything where we were having to think months and months and months out. And much more dramatically, we were looking at a global disruption to the supply chain. In localized natural disasters, you've got food being produced, distributed in other places, either in the country or around the world, that can be brought in. But what we started to realize quickly was the entire food supply chain globally was going to be affected, and maybe unprecedented, that nothing like this had quite ever happened at the scale. And so we were trying to figure out who's the most vulnerable in our community. How do we make sure that resources get to those communities first and foremost? And then how do we start thinking about this weeks out, months out, years out, in terms of the potential disruptions to the supply chain? So a lot of really big questions, a lot of real serious challenges. Fortunately, had lots of great people, both within the government and nonprofit sector, and then in the private sector, and we'll circle back to that question. But we were able to really come together and work in a coherent fashion to create a pretty good response. We've got a lot of stuff that we could have done differently, could have done better, that we need to still do better. But for the most part, I feel very proud of the work that we were able to do at the very onset of the pandemic, and that work has continued.
Thank you. Yeah, so much great work. And I want to pivot over to the county side and hear from Sheri in terms of, how you've interfaced and what you've been doing and how that has connected with the city.
Thanks so much, Karen. I think that, it's important to note that while Edwin and his team were doing the great work to sort of wrap our arms around what was happening, the county was seeing an increase in food pantries in our community centers. And of course, certainly due to, the job loss that already started at the end of March and in April, but also the fact that there was the supply chain disruption in the stores. People who were trying to meet their needs couldn't meet their needs and were looking to a lot of different outlets to meet those needs. And then from the perspective of the county, we already had the realization that our investments were woefully behind the need in the community. And so the good news for me was Edwin had done a great deal of work in terms of trying to, circle the wagon, so to speak, and really identify what the needs were in sort of a comprehensive way, but then how can we partner and address them? And so that's been great for the county because we were able to jump into the emergency, the emergency prepared meals area, which is probably the biggest deviation from what we normally do. We come from a space of trying to be transparent about social services investments. We have a procurement process, have been doing that for a while. And of course, this was an emergency that had to be addressed, that had to work outside of that. And so we had to push through our systems to get the meals out to the community as quickly as we could. And a lot of that was due in large part to the great work that Edwin and his team had already done.
Thank you. Yeah, I want to pivot over and think about investments from a different way and have Chris answer, because from the social services to the business side, hear about what you've seen and what you've been doing.
Yeah, it's been a busy time in the Economic Development Department. Just a few economic ramifications from COVID-19. I think I'll try to talk about this in a couple of different ways, but primarily I think sort of when we received the coronavirus relief fund from the federal government, there was a disbursement that was allocated to us to sort of allocate for grants to the business community, and immediately we were sort of posed with the question of what's the best way to sort of disseminate or distribute this money? If you have sort of such overwhelming need that really does surpass the funds that you have available, how do you start making some decisions about what to do with it? We ended up receiving over $128 million worth of grant requests. We had $16 million to distribute, so it gives you some sense for what the scale was that we were working with. And so we started trying to build a program and working with partners that would help us make sort of the best use of the funds that we had. And so we hired a number of different organizations within the community that we felt like had reach with community, and particularly parts of the community that are hard for us to sort of talk with. Often the folks who are left behind in some of the government programming, or folks who need a little bit of reassurance that this is a program that they can actually take advantage of, that it is for them. And so we tried to take a kind of community-based approach for getting the word out even. But then in the structure of the program itself, we used a scoring matrix to evaluate applications that considered things like the urgency of the need for a business, how much you had been affected by the pandemic itself, and then started factoring in other things like the sort of systematic kind of equity considerations that are a factor in Austin, and how do we think about distributing sort of grant funding in such a way that it actually contributes to healing some of the long-standing issues that do affect our community and are present even in our food space as well. I think we did really well with that. The largest recipients of our folks who operated in the food space, in the food sector, the largest three sectors were food, personal services, and like arts and culture organizations. And so I think felt really, really confident about where those funds were going. And the other thing is they were sort of restricted to businesses that had fewer than 25 employees. And so we knew we were sort of targeting those businesses that perhaps didn't have sufficient sort of staff capacity or other kind of capital capacity to go after other relief options that were out there. It was so I think that feels like a nice win. And we also structured the program in such a way that we got the money out fast, and it wasn't sort of a situation where you're applying for grants and then having to like get reimbursed later. It was, you got a check. And I think we did that consciously with the expectation that, frankly, that things were looking so bad that we just needed to get money out to stabilize things and then continue to have the conversation with industry partners that might point us toward where further efforts would help kind of businesses pivot or adopt new strategies, or where we could be supportive of kind of long-term growth. But really hard to have that conversation when you're staring sort of months of back rent in the face and don't have the resources to deal with that.
Thank you. Coming to Jennifer, really this idea of working community-based programming. Yeah, want to hear from you about what you've been doing and how it's transitioned and how it's been going.
Okay, so the Community Gardens program in Austin, before the pandemic happened, the gardens themselves were very dependent on in-person events, fundraisers, things like that. And so one of the first investments that we decided to make was in actually purchasing materials for the community gardens to help them increase their food production for the community garden members, and also to support the donations that some community gardens were making to emergency food providers. And so the investment was on a smaller scale. We invested several, thousands of dollars in purchasing mulch, compost, seedlings, and those were really important supplies that we were able to deliver to the community gardens so that they didn't have to worry about that. The other type of investment that I think about with the Community Gardens program is an investment in relationships. And so I was able to work with the Travis County AgriLife service because they had a huge quantity of seeds. And in the spring and early summer, seeds were more difficult to purchase because there was such a huge demand. And so I was able to work with Travis County to get access to seeds, and then working with park facilities, I set up curbside contactless pickup, kind of looking at the restaurants as a model for how do we distribute seeds in a way that's going to minimize risk. And so those were really important factors.
Thanks. You used a really interesting expression there that I think we'll get into our next part of the conversation: investment in relationships. And one of the things I'd love to hear more about is what types of partnerships, new partnerships, the different ways of interacting with community have really been critical over the pandemic, and different resources that have been brought into municipal and governmental work. And all of this getting at to what can we hold on to from this? Like there's this place where what we had before in terms of a food system was unacceptable already, levels of food insecurity and food access issues. So we're not trying to get back to there. We're trying to move beyond that, and also having to think about rebuilding. So love to hear about all of that wrapped up in terms of like new partnerships with this innovative work. What can be held onto, and what is potentially at risk of getting lost that shouldn't, right? Like if we've expanded access, why would we ever go back to not doing that?
So I guess I'll jump in and say, one of the things that I think is, can you guys hear me? Okay, all right, because I thought you were talking, Karen, thanks. Okay, one of the things I think is critical to note is that I think what has been magnified, something that probably in social services we knew, but it's certainly been underscored, and that is the people who are engaged in the system, we know how to reach them, right? But if there are people who are not connected, they're not on the grid, they're not part of a service that we're delivering on a regular basis, it's hard to reach out to them. So we know we needed innovation in terms of how we get to people who we might not readily know where they are, what they need, and how soon they need it. And I think we've been able to do that certainly with the CFRAE Cook Nooks program. That's an example of that, where there was a critical partnership, but that partnership not only is with government, but it's with agencies who I would argue probably were doing just fine in terms of being the grassroots, touching the people agencies that they wanted to be, but realizing that their clients were probably the ones most in need, but less connected. And so I think that's a critical lesson for us.
Thanks.
This makes me think a little bit about the food access coordination calls that you organized really early on, Edwin. And in my department, we sort of started organizing focus groups, just organized by industry sector, largely just to convene people and get a better sense for what the needs were, what ideas were out there, but also like what people were trying and what worked and what wasn't working, or what people were hearing, or also a really quick feedback loop on how good a job from the city's perspective we were doing in communicating with folks that we wanted to reach. Thinking about like the restaurant sector, for example, and how frequently sort of the guidelines around what best practices were or weren't, or what regulations were, or whether they were required or suggested, and things like that, and trying to get a sense for how we could be better operating as kind of relational partners with some of the different folks that we're trying to serve, and the value that we can create largely just by creating a space that allows other folks who are interested in the same thing to kind of come together, talk to each other, and give us the sort of input that's helpful in sort of pointing us towards more productive things that we can be doing for support.
Yeah, and I could just build on that. The emergency food access calls we helped start back in mid-March, hosting twice a week calls with, I think we got a listserv of almost 300 different organizations and individuals that are invited. So just basically join a call, was twice a week, now we've moved to once a week, is a way to just say what's the actual need live time in the community. One of the gigantic problems with government is we work really well when we have a year or two to like analyze a problem, think about the problem, talk to people about the problem, set up a program to analyze, potential solutions to that problem, and then rethink that and then implement the program. And what we saw in March was like, this kind of needs to happen like, tomorrow, or actually yesterday, or really 2 weeks ago, or maybe 200 years ago. And so these calls that we helped set up were really helpful in that we had, people from food banks and food pantries, community-based organizations all across Austin and Travis County and Central Texas, on the call basically saying, hey, this is what's happening right now in my parking lot. There is a line, 300 cars deep, and we don't have the food, and these people don't know where to go, and there's some really big challenges. And so that was incredibly helpful, and I think a really good lesson learned that, a lot of times we like to rely on data, and data is sort of like a comfortable thing for us because we can point to a research project and we can be assured that data research has been, validated in various ways. The problem in a pandemic is you don't have the time to do that. You just simply can't, get a research project up and going and get all that work done and then, analyze that data. And so we were basically, forced to use what, in retrospect is what we should always be doing, which is just like being present as much as you can in a pandemic with as many different community members as possible. So the challenge there is that, who gets invited to a call. And this is, one of the struggles that I have as a food policy manager with municipal government is, as a gatekeeper, like, my Rolodex, if that's still a thing, or list of names on my computer is a way to gatekeep the community. And so trying to open that door up and say, hey, like tell people that this is happening and we need to hear from a broader set of community members is really important. But then, we're conscious that, these sort of virtual conference calls are inhibiting other, members to certainly, to participate. Calls are predominantly in English and require, certain tech capacity. So, we know that we're gatekeeping the information that's flowing in, even when we make a pretty big effort to do something fairly quickly. But nevertheless, we were able to get a lot of really good information from community members. And I think we set a pretty good precedent for structuring how government can really get to a better understanding of the deeper issues in a community. And then that said, we were able to stand up some good relationships with the the University of Texas School of Public Health, as well as the Medical School's Population Health Department, to do both quantitative analysis of 211 calls and then qualitative survey information using phone surveys. So we were able to get, lifetime information from trusted stakeholders in the community, and then validate that with objective data from 211 calls about food insecurity, and then further get deeper into that information through telephone surveys. So sort of looking at a threefold strategy to develop a snapshot of what's happening and who's in need. Again, the challenge though is I think about this pandemic is I'm being asked sort of where should the resources go on a pretty regular basis. Like we got finite resources, where are those resources needed most? And to make an analogy of driving, I'm sort of driving a car, looking in the rearview mirror, trying to figure out where to go next. And it's impossible to do that. And for one, I'm not entirely certain that I need to be driving, and much less I don't know that I need to be looking in the rearview mirror while driving. And so how can we think more proactively about establishing systems where we have better input mechanisms to get data around emergency issues? And so that's certainly, I think I'm proud of the work that we've done, but recognize it's far from being perfect. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done, sort of embedding better relationships with government organizations deep into the community. So when these things happen, those relationships are already there and those sort of channels of information are already ready to flow.
Thanks. Jennifer, any thoughts?
Yes. So one thing that that happened this year, like really as a result of our inability to gather socially, was the launch of like virtual programs for the community gardeners, but also for the wider public. And so one of the things that I did is I started trying to work with, I did work with city staff and also with partners within the community, like gardening clubs, to launch kind of a Gardening 101 series, because there was such a huge interest in people wanting to either start gardening for the first time, or for existing gardeners, there was an interest in people wanting to get better at gardening so that they could grow more food. And so that virtual webinar series happened monthly last year, and it's going to continue. And I think it's going to be a permanent part of our program offerings. The other thing that I've been working on is trying to kind of build a stronger network of community gardeners, so that community garden coordinators and members can reach out to each other when they have questions about things like how to do outreach virtually when not all of the community garden members have a lot of tech savvy. And so kind of the sharing of knowledge between community gardens is something that I've really been working on, and just connecting gardeners to each other through through meetings. We also hosted a leadership training with the Austin Parks Foundation, again, just to focus on some of the skills and the questions that I was getting from a lot of different gardens. So building that resource so that they could reach out to each other was really important. And then also really focusing more efforts on the wider community, because again, before the pandemic, the community gardens themselves would host workshops. Neighbors would be able to stop in and ask questions. So when all of that ended, it was really important to find ways to share information.
Thanks. One of the things I'd love to dive a little deeper on, been talking about, about it in your answers, is some of the difficult choices that have had to been made. There's, you've been talking about like tensions between what government would have normally done and how it would normally operate, and then what you're being asked to do and what was needed to be done. And so getting into any of those specifics about some of those difficult choices that have had to be made, and hopefully at this conference with the people attending as a way to start to spark connections and build some new solutions. Sheri?
So I'll take a stab at that. And I agree with Edwin. Government, we could probably study something to death before we get out there and actually grab a hold of it. But by the same token, you know, there's a great deal of accountability in government, and you know, we don't lose that even in a pandemic. So there are certain questions we have to ask. But I think, at least for Travis County, there was a willingness to sort of bust the silos, and I think that that's what we need to do all the time, and maybe not just in emergencies. And we've seen that in flooding events and hurricanes and whatnot, that it becomes a whole lot easier to convince folks to do a contract a little faster or push something through a queue a little faster when there's recognition that there's an emergency and there are people who need to receive a service on the other end of that. But I think we need to reach a place where we're comfortable with busting those silos every day, because that really is what allowed us to do some of the great work that we're, you know, talking about at this conference, but also, you know, related to this event, because people have chosen to not do things the way we always do them. So I think for us at Travis County, the willingness to move things through our system much faster than they normally move. And even in doing that, recognizing there's an increased need, there's a greater number of people who need our services, and trying to address those things as quickly as possible. And I think that that's something we ought to keep.
Chris?
Yeah, I mean, thinking back on the small business grant program, I think there were a lot of hard choices to make, largely that sort of arose out of a bit of what you were talking about, Sheri. I think where you have like values that are in conflict. You have, like, on the one hand, we want to be accountable and spend taxpayer money to, you know, the best that we absolutely can, and on the other hand, we needed to get this money out like a week ago, so that's a problem. I think, like, similar sort of situation where, you know, we wanted to make the best possible decision we could in terms of who we awarded grants to, and at the same time we wanted an application that was short and reasonably easy to fill out and didn't ask people to give us, you know, every piece of information that they could ever find. And even in sort of value choices that you have to make, whether, you know, I mean, the decision to prioritize small businesses or businesses that we thought were more vulnerable to continued pandemic-related economic impacts was a choice, because we also could have sort of prioritized large employers or something like that in an effort to make sure that we were kind of retaining the maximum number of jobs. I think, like, I mostly just am sort of thinking about this in terms of, like, there wasn't a great blueprint in place for what you do when, like, you don't have enough resources to deal with a major pandemic that, as it turns out, is going to last, you know, close to a year. But I think you're right that there are all these steps along the way where you're asked to make value judgments in terms of how you operationalize whatever programming or response you're going to do. And it is really, I think, valuable to know what you want to accomplish as an organization, or what the community is going to need or want ahead of time, so that you can be a bit more responsive and in a reasonable amount of time, so you kind of have a sense for, like, what you want to accomplish, because there are all those trade-offs, I think, are sort of built into whatever you might want to do in terms of a recovery program.
Thanks. Yeah, interesting. Edwin?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great thought, and to build off Sheri's sort of silo busting, you know, we're presented with a challenge at the beginning of the pandemic: finite resources to address an unknown level of food insecurity. You know, unacceptable food insecurity pre-pandemic. The only thing we know for certain is that the food insecurity rate is going to skyrocket. You know, projections of 40% unemployment, you know, 50% food insecurity. So one of the first things that we did was look around and figure out, okay, we know that we're going to need a ton more prepared meals immediately, like within the next month. Like, we need to have a contract in place so that we might need 1 million prepared meals to be delivered to the community each week. Who the heck can do that? And how do we get a contract in place where, if that turns out to be the case, we're ready to do that? Had some really difficult conversations with, you know, some of the school districts, and basically, like, they're saying, hey, you know, our schools are going to close. We're going to try to pivot to curbside meal pickups, but it's entirely possible that our entire cafeteria staff is also going to get infected, and they're going to close down. And then what do we do? and basically saying, like, whose responsibility will it be to feed both the children in our community and the parents of those students? And so we entered into some contracts very, very quickly and very early on that were very easy to do because there were sort of known quantities of organizations, national organizations that could deliver very large quantities of food, nutritionally adequate at a good price point. What they missed the mark on, though, from my perspective, was the local economic impact and the local sourcing of food. So while we did have good contracts in place that were ensuring that we were able to get volumes of nutritionally adequate food out the door, we were missing the mark on some things. And so in terms of silo busting, what we then did after about 2 months of that was start looking around and say, how do we actually shift this to start really addressing the economic turmoil at the local business level, and also addressing sourcing from local producers. The local farming community, regional Central Texas farmers really got thrown into a pretty challenging loop. Some of them were having higher demand than they'd ever had through CSAs and those kind of things. Others at farmers markets were seeing plummeting sales because farmers markets got really constricted in terms of how many people could attend. And then the local farming community that was trying to sell to restaurants just got crushed. And so we had a lot of local farmers that had relied on those restaurant contracts, and all of a sudden the restaurants were like, not only do we not have the capacity to buy your food, even if we did, we couldn't afford it anymore, so sorry. So we were able to pivot to some different contracts that were able to get money to local restaurants and have those local restaurants pay their employees living wages and pledge to purchase a significant amount of product from local Central Texas producers. Much better outcome than what we had originally talked about. So the challenge from my perspective is, how do we embed that kind of contract language into our future natural disaster responses? Because we know there's going to be another natural disaster, there's likely to be another pandemic. How do we get in place those systems so that next time it happens, we pull out the playbook and the first page says, these are our priorities. It's not just to address food insecurity. It's not just to get nutritionally adequate food at a good price. It's also to ensure that these dollars get looped back into the community, support local restaurants, or support local businesses, and to address the need to support our broader local economy. That's a lot to ask out of a contract. And having done a lot of city contracts before, I can say they're not very easy to do. And the more pre-planning that we can do to sort of embed that language and get it approved ahead of time and say, yes, these are the things that we think are important, the more likely it will be that we'll be able to respond in a timely fashion and really get all of those wins. So not easy to do, but we now know that's what we need to do. And hopefully, over the next couple of months, we can start focusing more on embedding those kind of systems and structures into our government response in preparation for the next big challenge that we've got.
Thanks. Jennifer?
I think for me, this question is really just about the challenges that were highlighted during the pandemic, things that that I knew and that that the people working with community gardens kind of that we knew existed before the pandemic. But I think questions around like access and equity, those issues to me became highlighted during this. They're highlighted during this time when I'm so dependent on virtual networking and outreach. And so the challenges that I'm going to be really focused on moving forward and things that I've started to look at in the past year are things like, how do we get like a more equitable distribution of community gardens throughout the city? And then also looking at language access, recognizing that there are gardeners who speak a variety of different languages. And I think that I've been able to learn some best practices from Austin Public Health, like from their pandemic response, and seeing what they were able to offer has given me ideas for how to increase language access within the program. And even thinking about things like ensuring that there's American Sign Language interpretation available during virtual programming and meetings. So those are the topics that I really want to focus on moving forward. And I also think that being in close contact with community garden coordinators has shown me what their needs are. And so a lot of my focus is again, on making sure that the existing gardens have what they need. And then moving forward, thinking about how to help other people get gardens started in their communities.
Thanks. It's so hard to think about wrapping this conversation up. We've got some great questions coming in, but real quickly before we pivot, I wanted to give a chance to just ask each of you, like, is there anything final that you want to share related to this topic? And then we'll try to get to a couple of questions. Sheri or Chris? Oh.
Sure. I'm happy to start. So I guess for me, the big thing is, I think that from a policy level and leadership perspective, we need to hear the voices of the people at this conference and the people who are watching this session, because there are a lot of things that the community shows up at Commissioner's Court to talk about, and rightly so, and very important topics. But I can tell you that not so much do people show up to talk about food insecurity and what you want your tax dollars spent on in terms of making sure that the community has access to the food that it needs. And so I would say that even with the good work we've done, I think if our policymakers can hear from the community that this is an activity, this is a service that you value, I think that it makes it easier for us to come together and really craft some solutions that stick. Thank you so much for having me today.
Thank you. Chris, looked like you wanted to add something.
Yeah, I mean, I think I'm just sort of, this conversation is bringing this thought back around, which is just that in a lot of ways, I feel like the pandemic has been something that sort of disrupted things, but that disruption has been sort of felt. It's stretched all the places where we were already stretched in, right? It has exacerbated all of the issues that we knew were already there. If you were already feeling affordability pressures before the pandemic, is the thing that finally sort of made it such that you couldn't keep going. If you were already sort of feeling all of the issues around kind of the inequities in our local economy and all these different things, it's the pandemic that sort of provided the shock to this, but it didn't create these conditions. And I keep kind of wanting to refocus at least my own thoughts and I think the work that the city of Austin could be doing on if the pandemic is sort of a motivating factor, great, but like the target ultimately hasn't changed, and I think it's just critically important for us to be working on some of these big structural problems that Austin is facing, and thinking about them as preparation for some future disaster if needed, but that these things go hand in hand, that like the terrible things that you're seeing in the context of food access or economic insecurity or disruption or displacement and all these other factors brought on by the pandemic are there all the time. They're just made slightly worse or more extreme by these sort of extraordinary circumstances, I guess.
Thank you.
And
Jennifer, yeah, thanks. We've really quickly.
Yes, really quickly. And I just wanted to just point out that community gardens are, even though they're smaller than commercial operations, that they do really play a very important part in the local food community for the community garden members and for the people who live in those areas. There are a number of gardens that do donate produce to emergency food providers. And I think during the pandemic, the other really important piece about community gardens is kind of the mental wellness aspect. There are several senior gardens in Austin that provided an outlet for those members. Like they were able to go and actually have activities that they could do outside safely. And so that's something that I've heard from several community garden members, is how important that space has been for them.
Thanks. Edwin, final thoughts?
Yeah, just the final thought would be, our food system is broken fundamentally, and the pandemic has just shown exactly how broken it is, and in different places. The thing that keeps me up at night is recognizing like all of our food is basically picked by immigrants or undocumented immigrants, and our entire social safety network is not set up to support that community during these kind of disasters. And all of the programs that we generally stand up are going to basically miss the mark on supporting the people that actually grow our food and pick our food and deliver our food. And there's huge amounts of work that needs to be done at the federal level, at the state level. And I think, we've got some work to do at the city and the county on that. I'd love to see contracts that embed requirements for, purchasing X amount of products from farms that have a fair labor certification. That I know of, we don't have any farms in the entire state of Texas that have a fair labor certification. And it's a huge opportunity, and we can do that structurally through contracts, and we can put downward pressure on the supply chain to demand that local producers and producers across Texas take farm labor certification seriously. It's going to have a huge impact on, the people that do the hardest work for us and receive the least bit of support. So certainly something that I'm really interested in doing, and know that we've got a long way to go to try to really address those big inequities.
Thank you. Thank you all for all the hard work you were doing, prior to the pandemic, during, and going forward. I think, apologies, we didn't get to the questions, but I think the number of questions show that, how much work there still is to do, obviously recognized by all the amazing people on this panel working in your areas. And I think some of the panelists are going to try to answer some of the questions in the chat. So yeah, the conversation will go on, and I just want to thank everyone for your time and your hard work.
Thank you.
Thank you.